Ancient witness this morning comes from Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 15. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for a denarius for the day, he set them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" He said to them, they said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When the evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received a denarius. Now, when the first came, they thought they would receive more. But each of them received a denarius. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us. And we have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose and what belongs to me? Are you envious because I am generous?"
And so we pray that through these readings and our time here together, that God may speak to us in our hearts. Now, many of you probably already know this, but one of the probably the primary way that Jesus taught was through parables. And if we read the New Testament, we see lots of these parables. And the thing about parables is that there's no one right interpretation, that they defy simple understanding. One could say that, there are many different ways to view the very same parable. So they're kind of like a Zen koan, which is meant to have the listeners ponder and wrestle to find the wisdom that is within themselves. And yet the church has often tried to pigeonhole and categorize each one of these parables, and that process began almost at the beginning, hundreds of years after Jesus died. In just 100 years after Jesus died, in the writing of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic Gospels, you find that the editor of those Gospels actually had editorial information that tried to interpret those parables or have the right interpretation. So, today's parable has a traditional understanding, an interpretation that goes something like this: that the householder is a figure that represents God, and the vineyard represents the church. And the workers that were hired first represent those who were with Jesus from the very beginning. And those that were hired later represented the more recent converts. Now, in this interpretation, the parable is about God's grace. That is, salvation is generously given to all who accept the invitation to the vineyard, and it cannot be earned. It doesn't matter if one works all day or doesn't work at all. That the payment is the same for all, and it comes from God's unconditionality. So, this kind of interpretation is called an allegorical interpretation, and is perfectly fine, where the parable corresponds to things that are heavenly, to these theological truths. However, I think that there are many other ways of looking at the parable. First, it's important to understand the kind of world in which Jesus, the peasant prophet, spoke his parables. And it's important to understand the roles that the people played at the time. Jesus lived in a highly stratified society. And if you look at the cover of your bulletin, I just want to point you to this cover right here. Right there. You'll see a graphic, and this is from a pioneer in the field. His name was Gerhard Linsky, and he wrote this book called Power and Privilege. And you'll see that on this graphic that there's this huge concentration of power and privilege and the enormous gap between the rich and the poor. So in the parable, we have first the householder. This man belonged to the wealthy elite landowner class, and so that would be near the top of this interior part of the graphic. And in the parable, he had a steward, which means that he had this landowner had substantial holdings and had many employees, many servants and slaves. And his crop was a vineyard, which initially takes over 4 years to bear fruit and return money. So therefore, he needed a lot of resources to make this kind of capital investment. The vineyard is also a cash crop, yielding a luxury product, which is wine. And so whenever it's possible, the landowners would acquire more and more land by foreclosing on the loans of the peasant farmers. And then they converted these new acquired lands to vineyards. When they once were planted before, they were planted for crops, for mixed grains, for the actual sustainable life of the people. By the way, the continual displacement of the peasant farmers from the land and the growing of cash crops, such as coffee, bananas, and cotton today, to the exclusion of everything else, is often cited as one of the major causes of world hunger today in our global market. Now, it appears that the landowner bargains with this first group of workers. But it's essentially, if you notice, a take it or leave it offer. A denarius is what I'll pay, he says. On the other trips to the marketplace, he simply orders them saying, I'll pay you whatever is right. And you can hear the landowner's contempt toward the workers when he addresses them. He says, why are you standing here idle all day? Why aren't you working? In other words, why are you so lazy? Right? Now, I want to pause for a minute and ask, why, in the first place, were all these people standing and waiting for work in the marketplace? There appears to be great unemployment. And because there's great unemployment, the workers had very low bargaining power. They didn't have any leverage. It's not surprising then that they would simply go and work with no agreement what the wages would be, because they would take anything they could get. And the landowners wanted it that way too. They liked it that way. In fact, it was a very common strategy of the Roman landowners to hire workers only for a day at a time, to keep them in the weakest possible bargaining position. Now, a lot of this analysis I'm getting from this book is from a guy named William Herzog, and he wrote this landmark book called Parables as Subversive Speech. I love that title, Parables as Subversive speech. And he said this, he says, far from being generous then, the householder is taking advantage of an unemployed workforce to meet his harvesting needs by offering them work without a wage agreement. And what of these day laborers? These are people whose hunger has driven them to the countryside at harvest time. They are the class which has been termed the expendables. And so if you look on this graphic, you'll see at the very bottom of this are the expendables. They are even lower than the slaves, because the slaves were seen as an investment, you see. And so you wanted to make sure that your slaves were well fed and healthy. But these expendables, to use Thomas Hobbes' famous phrase, were for whom life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. They were largely composed of the excess children of the peasants, who could afford to pass on their inheritance to only one child, typically the eldest male. And so their holdings were too meager to support more children. And so some of these people were also former free peasants who were forced off from their land when their land was foreclosed upon. They couldn't afford to pay the loan anymore. So the best that these expendables could hope for was to work in the fields at planting and harvest times, and then get some charity in between. Sometimes they saw their best options as joining outlaw bands where they could survive for a time before they might be hunted down. People, once they fell into the expendable class, usually lived about 5 to 7 years. And they were forced to beg on the streets as they were dying of malnutrition near the end of their lives. And so this is important to understand. This was the kind of world in which Jesus lived, this early agrarian society. And it reminds me of a book that I read by Adam Hochschild called King Leopold's Ghost. It was about how King Leopold II of Belgium acquired what became to be known as the Congo. And much like earlier agrarian societies, he squeezed as much wealth as he possibly could in the form of ivory and rubber. And this was near the end of the 19th century. And in the Congo, the workers were barely kept at a subsistence level. It was this delicate balance. Too much, and the people would die and it would be useless. Too little, and he wasn't really maximizing the extraction of the wealth, you see. It was estimated that in 20 years of this reign of King Leopold, 10 million people died under this regime that brought, quote, civilization and Christianity to the Congo. Now, often, the women of the tribes were held as hostage until the men harvested their quota of rubber. And to maintain order, sometimes whole villages were slaughtered. And there was this practice of soldiers having to present a severed hand for each rifle cartridge that they shot so as not to waste the bullets. It was a nasty existence. And a young shipping supervisor, his name was Edward Morel, noticed when the ships were coming back that they were full of these, they were laden with these goods, of ivory and rubber and other things. But when they left Antwerp, they were empty. So nothing was going in, except maybe some ammunition. And so what Morel did is he quit his job and he became the greatest British investigative journalist of his day. and he organized this human rights campaign on behalf of the people of the Congo and the heartless extraction of wealth by a tiny elite class. This was the kind of world in which Jesus lived. Now, in the parable, there's also this question about the denarius. It's been said that it was the usual day's wage. This is even written in some of the Bible translations. You know, it was inserted at a later time, of course. But was it generous? Several anthropologists have written that a denarius was no better than a subsistence wage. It was barely enough to live on for one day. But this would not sustain life because a day laborer worked so infrequently. And so the day laborers who were hired first complained because they had been shamed. They had, quote, borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. But the owner makes them wait to be paid, while all the others get paid first. And then they receive the same wages of those who worked for much, much less. And so part of what is going on here, according to Herzog, is that the owner humiliates them and degrades the value of their day-long effort. And so they naturally complain. And the owner denies the charge and picks out their leader and makes an example of him. He said, "Friend, did you not agree to work for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and get out of here." Again, we can hear the landowner's words drip with sarcasm and contempt. So this worker is publicly banned, blackballed. This is a fatal dismissal. And what we see is blaming the victim. William Ryan, an author, describes this age-old practice. He said, first, identify a social problem. Second, study those affected by the problem and discover in what ways they are different from the rest of us as a consequence of the deprivation and injustice. And then third, define the differences as the cause of the social problem itself. Now, this has been done throughout history. This was done to Native Americans on a massive scale, right? They were viewed as unintelligent savages who needed to be tamed, who had terrible problems with alcohol, right? They're the problem. This was done to the African American slaves using similar kind of analysis. Also today we have the scandal of poverty in the wealthiest nation of the world. And what dominates the discussion is often these generalizations about welfare cheating, fraud, and dependency. Blame the victim of the situation. It's an age-old approach. So the owner then says, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? And by the way, this statement would be viewed as blasphemy by those committed to the Torah tradition, which says that God is the owner and God gives the land to the people. In fact, the land was to be redistributed every Jubilee year, and the debt was canceled on every sabbatical year for this very reason, because it kept getting concentrated and had to be redistributed, you see. This was in the Torah. And so the owner then tries to justify his own behavior in the parable. There are all kinds of justifications. Some today of the neoliberal free market laissez-faire economists who I've read and spoken to say that oppressive, for example, sweatshop labor is actually doing people a good thing since it's part of economic development. All kinds of justification. And when protesters of the World Trade Organization ask for human provisions for workers to be included into the trade agreements, they are opposed by the global corporations and their local puppet elites. There's all kinds of justifications. Now, in this alternative interpretation of the parable that I'm laying out there for you, who's the hero of the story? The hero of the story is the day laborer who had the courage to stand up to the landowner. Again, Herzog wrote this. Jesus arranged their meeting at one of the few moments in the economic cycle in which the elites were dependent on the lowliest of laborers. To ensure a timely harvest, the landowner needed their labor. Yet the lack of cohesion so evident among the day laborers allowed the landowner to conquer them by dividing them. This is why the owner spoke only to, quote, one of them. The banishment of that one served to intimidate the others and put them in their place. And so, if Jesus met the parable in this way, if this interpretation has truth to it, what effect would it have had on the hearers? Well, the primary purpose then would not to be communicate some heavenly truth, but rather to unmask the oppression that exists in this world. The parable invites its hearers to see the problems of our worldly situation and then to think about them and to discuss them. How would this unjust situation change, we can ask, if God's kingdom were to come on earth? Likewise, how would our situation today in our world need to change if God's kingdom were to come on earth? And isn't that, after all, Jesus' prayer? That we help bring God's kingdom of justice on earth? Amen.